The silence in that room lasted 6 seconds. I know it was six because I had been counting since I closed my presentation folder, watching the second hand on the wall clock behind the long mahogany table tick once, twice, 6 times before anyone breathed. I had just finished explaining 7 months of work. Market analysis, projected margins, competitive positioning, 3 full quarters of modeling against industry benchmarks. I had run the numbers 4 times. I had practiced the closing argument in my home office the night before with my notes spread across the desk and the city quiet outside the window. I had walked them through a strategy I genuinely believed could add $2 million in annual revenue to the firm's mid-market portfolio within 18 months. And now the room was quiet, and I was standing at the head of a 40-foot conference table on the 22nd floor of Hallstrom Capital Group's downtown headquarters, waiting. Then Brendan Maddox folded his hands on the table. He was 35 years old. He had been director of strategic initiatives at Hallstrom for exactly 8 months. He had the kind of tailored suit that you don't buy on a salary, the kind of watch that catches the light at every gesture, and the kind of relaxed posture that comes from never really sitting in a room where the answer to anything he said was no. He looked at me, gave a small thoughtful nod, and said, "Catherine, I appreciate the thoroughness, but I think we're moving in a more contemporary direction." That was all. Across the table, someone tapped a pen twice against a notepad. Someone else exhaled in a way that was almost a laugh. Not quite, close enough that I felt it in my chest. I gathered my printed handouts. I thanked the room. I walked back to my seat on the side of the table, sat down, and spent the rest of the meeting looking at the title page of my proposal, Mid-Market Expansion Framework, Phase 1, while the conversation drifted on to a quarterly branding refresh. My name is Catherine Holloway. I was 51 years old that morning. I held the title of Senior Director of Corporate Strategy. I had been at Hallstrom Capital Group for 11 years, and I had just watched a room of people I had served for over a decade dismiss a strategy I had built piece by piece in under 6 minutes. The framework was not a hypothetical. It was a complete acquisition and integration model designed around 3 regional firms I had personally identified, analyzed, and quietly built early relationships with over more than a year. I had spoken with 2 of their CEOs informally, the kind of careful conversations that happen at industry dinners and on phone calls that don't appear on a calendar. Both had indicated genuine openness to a serious discussion. The pricing structure was already mapped. The integration timeline was already drafted. The risk profile was already stress-tested against 2 recessionary models. I had brought all of that into the room. I had laid it out cleanly. And it was waved away before my coffee had cooled. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It was not anger. Anger came later, slowly, the way frost forms on a window overnight. What I felt sitting at that table was something quieter, a kind of internal stillness, like the moment after you drop something fragile and you haven't yet looked down to see if it broke. I had given that work everything I had outside of the meetings and the reports and the daily noise of corporate life. I had believed in it enough to put my own reputation on the line with 2 CEOs I deeply respected. And the man who had been at Hallstrom for 8 months, who had never closed an acquisition, who had never sat across from a founder during a difficult negotiation at 1 in the morning, that man had just dismissed 11 years of judgment with 1 sentence in front of 9 other people. That was a Wednesday in February. I tell you this now because I want you to understand something before I explain what came after. This is not a story about being pushed out. I was not pushed out. This is a story about what happens when an institution discards something real and then has to watch a competitor pick it up, fund it, and execute it inside 72 hours. I did not arrive at Hallstrom Capital Group as a senior director. I started as a senior analyst on the corporate strategy desk, which is a respectable title that means almost nothing in the daily reality of the work. It meant I built financial models late into the evening for partners who would scan the first page over coffee the next morning. It meant I produced industry briefings that ended up summarized in 2 bullet points on someone else's slide deck. I was 39 years old, recently divorced, and rebuilding a career that had taken a quieter path than I had once planned for myself. I was meticulous, I was patient, and I could read a balance sheet the way some people read a face. I could tell when something was off long before the auditors flagged it, and I had a habit of writing the awkward question into the margin of every report I touched. Over 11 years, I moved up. Not in dramatic jumps, not with announcements at all-hands meetings, but steadily. By year 3, I was leading market analysis on every mid-market deal Hallstrom evaluated. By year 5, I had designed the firm's internal scoring framework for acquisition targets, a system that was still in use the day Brendan Maddox waved off my presentation. By year 7, I had personally led the diligence process on a $48 million acquisition that turned into one of the firm's 3 best-performing portfolio assets. By year 9, 2 of our largest institutional clients had requested in writing that I be the named strategy lead on any expansion work involving their capital, not the department, not the senior partner above me. Me, by name, Catherine Holloway, written into the engagement letters. I don't tell you this to sound impressive. I tell you because it matters to what comes later. There were 2 moments I think about often when I try to explain the kind of work I did at Hallstrom. The first was in year 4. A potential acquisition target had cleared every preliminary screen and was 3 weeks away from a signed letter of intent. I had been reviewing their audited financials at home on a Saturday morning when I noticed an inconsistency in their accounts receivable aging schedule. It was small. It was the kind of detail that 99 analysts out of 100 would have skimmed past. I spent the next 40 hours pulling apart their disclosures, and what I found was a pattern of revenue recognition that, if it had stayed buried until after close, would have cost Hallstrom somewhere between $14 and $19 million in write-downs within the first year of ownership. I flagged it. We walked away. 6 months later, that company restated its earnings publicly and lost more than half its valuation. No one outside my immediate team ever knew that story. The senior partner I reported to at the time thanked me privately. The firm moved on. The second was in year 8. A long-standing client was preparing to pull a significant capital commitment because of a misunderstanding about how Hallstrom had structured a recent deal. I sat with that client for 3 hours one evening in their office and walked them through every assumption, every projection, every reason the structure had been built the way it had. I did not sell. I explained. They kept the commitment. The capital was worth, in retention alone, just over $30 million to the firm. That was the kind of work I did. I did not have a finance pedigree from the schools that get mentioned in industry profiles. I had a state university degree, a CFA designation earned at night, and 26 years of doing the thing rather than describing the thing. I drove a sensible sedan. I had a son in graduate school, real tuition, real living expenses, and a small house I had spent 8 years paying down on my own. I was not a woman who could afford to make impulsive decisions. I had turned down 3 recruiter calls in the 5 years before that Wednesday in February. 3 real conversations with 3 serious firms. I had said no to each of them because I believed in what I was building at Hallstrom, because I thought loyalty to good work was its own currency, because I thought that, after a decade of being the person who quietly held the firm's analytical spine in place, the institution would eventually recognize what it had standing in the room. I was wrong about that. It took me longer than it should have to understand how wrong. Brendan Maddox arrived at Hallstrom in June of the year before that February meeting. He came in through Gregory Hallstrom himself, the founder and managing partner, who had been hearing the same word from the board for almost 2 years. Modernization. The board wanted the firm to feel current. They wanted language like agile capital deployment, data-forward strategy, next-generation portfolio architecture. They wanted someone who could walk into a partners' meeting and make the future sound inevitable. Brendan was that person. He had a graduate degree from a school whose name carries weight in elevators and at golf clubs. He had spent the previous 5 years at a strategy consulting firm, where, as best as I could tell, He had advised institutions on what to do without ever having to be the person who actually did it. He spoke quickly and confidently. He used the word framework the way some people use the word lunch. He had the bearing of a man who had been told for most of his life that he was going to be important and who had never been given a serious reason to doubt it. I want to be careful about how I describe him. I did not dislike Brendan personally. He was not aggressive. He did not raise his voice. He did not corner people in hallways. What he was something more difficult than open hostility. He was politically fluent and substantively thin. And in a firm that had quietly begun rewarding polish over precision, that combination made him very, very effective. Within his first 90 days, Brendan paused 2 long-running initiatives that had been producing measurable results. He explained that the firm needed to realign around what he called core strategic verticals. He launched a rebrand of the client-facing materials, new fonts, new color palette, new tagline. He introduced a series of what he called innovation roundtables, quarterly sessions where senior staff were asked to brainstorm and produce deliverables. The deliverables, as far as I ever saw, were almost exclusively slide decks, beautifully designed slide decks, carefully animated slide decks that referenced data I had personally produced, presented as if the data itself had been generated by the act of putting it inside a Maddox-branded template. I kept doing my job. I kept running the diligence on active deals. I kept producing the analysis that fed every committee meeting and every quarterly update. I kept the firm's analytical core functioning the way it had always functioned. And I watched quietly as the credit for that work began to migrate, not loudly, not through any single dramatic theft, but through a kind of gentle institutional gravity toward Brendan's office. When the quarterly portfolio review went to the board, the modeling was mine. The framing was his. When a client praised Hallstrom's analytical rigor in a written review, Brendan was the one who forwarded the email to Gregory with a brief, gracious note. He was not stealing exactly. He was simply always in the room, always holding the document, always the person whose name ended up attached to the outcome. He had become very good at standing next to the work without ever having to do it. I understood eventually what the mid-market expansion framework presentation had really been. It was not just a strategic proposal. It was a test of whether the kind of value I brought, technical, careful, real, still had a seat in the firm Hallstrom was becoming. The answer came back in 6 seconds of silence and one polite phrase from a man who had been at the firm for 8 months. The structure had changed, and the new structure did not need me to fit inside it. It needed me to stay productive, keep the analytical machinery running, and let someone else take the credit for the results. I had done exactly that for long enough. I went back to my office after the meeting, and I did what I always did. I returned 3 client emails. I reviewed a draft term sheet. I took a 15-minute call with a portfolio company's CFO about a quarterly variance. I was professional and composed, and I said all the appropriate things. From the outside, nothing had shifted, but something inside me had quietly clicked into a new position, like a lock that had been turning the same direction for 11 years and had, without warning, found a different groove. That evening, I drove home through a slow February rain, and I started thinking, clearly and without sentiment, about my actual position at Hallstrom Capital Group. Not my title, not my salary. My real position, the structural kind, the kind that only becomes visible when something breaks. The first thing I thought about was the client relationships. 2 of Hallstrom's largest institutional clients had my name written into their engagement letters as the named strategy lead. That language was not decorative. Those clients had requested it specifically because they trusted me and because they had learned over multiple deal cycles that I was the person who would tell them the truth about what their capital was actually doing. If my role at the firm changed materially, those engagement letters required formal notification, and in one case, written client consent. I was reasonably certain that no one in firm leadership had reviewed those documents recently. I was almost certain Brendan had never seen them at all. The second thing I thought about was the analytical infrastructure. Over more than 7 years, I had built the internal scoring framework that the entire deal team used on every acquisition target. I had built it in layers, adding refinements as the firm grew, integrating new data sources, embedding the institutional learnings from every deal we had closed and every deal we had walked away from. My direct team knew how to use the framework. The senior partners depended on its outputs, but no one, not one person inside that building, fully understood the underlying logic of how it worked. I had never been asked to fully document it. I had offered twice. The offers had gone nowhere. The third thing I thought about was the mid-market expansion framework itself. I had built it almost entirely on my own time. The research, the modeling, the competitive analysis, the early relationship conversations with the three target CEOs, all of it had taken place in evenings, on weekends, on flights I had taken for personal reasons. I had used my own laptop for the modeling. I had used my own contacts for the introductions. I had never filed the project under an internal initiative code because it had never been one. It had been my work. I had brought it to Hallstrom as an offering. They had declined it, which meant in any meaningful legal sense they had no claim to it. I sat with all of this for a few days. I did not call an attorney. I did not tell my son. I did not write any of it down. I simply let it settle. What I felt was not vindication. It was not even anticipation. It was something quieter than both. It was the feeling of standing in a building you have worked inside for over a decade, and suddenly noticing that the floor plan in your mind is more accurate than the one in anyone else's. I had more leverage than they understood, and they had less time than they realized. The thing that finally moved me was not a single moment. It was two events, 2 weeks apart, that lined up like a pair of cracks running across the same wall until they met in the middle. The first happened on a Thursday afternoon in late February. A colleague of mine, a woman named Elaine who had been with Hallstrom almost as long as I had, and who I trusted as much as I trusted anyone inside the firm, asked if I had a few minutes for coffee. We went down to the lobby cafe. She stirred her cup for a long moment before she spoke. She had been in a partner's briefing earlier that morning. Brendan had circulated a document. She had not read all of it, but she had read enough. Buried in the middle of the document was a section titled Mid-Market Strategic Repositioning. It described, in slightly softened language, an acquisition framework targeting regional firms in the firm's existing investment lanes. It outlined a phased integration timeline. It referenced projected revenue impact in a range that was almost identical to the numbers I had presented 2 weeks earlier. The three target firms were not named, but the criteria used to describe them were specific enough that anyone who had been paying attention would recognize who they were. Elaine looked at me over her coffee. She did not need to say it. Brendan had taken the bones of my framework, sanded the specifics off, replaced my analytical language with his strategic language, and presented it to the partners as a concept that had emerged from his own thinking. My name was not in the document. My 7 months of work were not referenced. The early conversations I had personally cultivated with 2 of the 3 target CEOs were not mentioned, because of course they could not be mentioned. Brendan did not know they existed. He had taken a presentation that had been waved off in a conference room and reintroduced it as his own original contribution to the firm's future. I thanked Elaine for telling me. I went back upstairs. I did not say a word to anyone. I sat at my desk and worked through a portfolio review for the rest of the afternoon. The second event happened 10 days later. My annual performance review was delivered. I had spent the previous year leading 3 significant client engagements with no escalations. I had maintained the scoring framework without a single material failure. I had identified the disclosure issue on a target company that had saved the firm a probable 7-figure write-down. I had retained both named clients through their renewal cycles. My client satisfaction scores were the highest in my department for the 3rd consecutive year. My rating was solid contributor, the middle category, the category they use when they want to keep you in place without giving you a reason to expect anything new. My supervising partner, a decent man named Howard who had clearly been given language to use, read the assessment to me in his office, and explained with what I believe was genuine discomfort that there were no salary adjustments available in my band this cycle. The firm, he said, was focused on strategic capital allocation. He used the word strategic 4 times in the span of 3 minutes. He did not look at me when he said most of it. I was 51 years old. I had been at Hallstrom for 11 years. I had personally protected the firm from significant capital loss on multiple occasions. I had retained tens of millions of dollars in client commitments, and the official institutional position was that I was a solid contributor. Nothing more. That night, my son called from his apartment near campus. He was asking about a textbook he could not afford to buy outright and was trying to find used. We talked for 20 minutes. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and I made a decision. I want to be clear that the decision was not emotional. That is the part I want you to understand. I was not angry in the way that makes a person do something rash. I was finished in the way that makes a person do something deliberate. I was going to stop protecting a firm that had already, quietly and clearly, decided I was a fixture rather than a person. I was going to respond to the next serious recruiter call that came in, and I was going to take the mid-market expansion framework with me when I left, because it had never belonged to Hallstrom in the first place. I had offered it. They had said no. The offer was no longer available. The message had been sitting in my inbox for 16 days when I finally opened it again. A recruiter named David Park, reaching out on behalf of a client in the institutional investment space. He described the role in broad strokes: senior leadership, strategy and acquisitions, compensation commensurate with experience. He used the word commensurate, which I appreciated. I had read his note when it first arrived, considered it for about a minute, and gone back to work. That was the old habit. That was the version of me that still thought staying was the right answer. I replied to David on a Friday evening from my personal email. Short message. I told him I was open to a confidential conversation. He called on Monday morning before 9. The client was Carrington Whitfield Partners, mid-sized, privately held, growing aggressively in the exact mid-market segment I had been studying for almost a year. They had been watching the same regional firms I had been quietly tracking. They had identified a window in the market they believed was open for somewhere between 12 and 16 months. They were looking for someone senior, technical, and operational. Someone who could not just describe the strategy but build it, run it, and execute it. I knew the firm. I had crossed paths with 2 of their senior partners at industry conferences over the years. They had a reputation in the institutional community for being analytically serious and politically light. They paid people. They listened to people. They moved. I took a screening call that Wednesday. Then a longer conversation with their chief investment officer the following Monday. I was careful through all of it. I scheduled the calls during lunch hours from a quiet corner of a parking garage 2 blocks from the office. I never used my work phone. I never used my work email. I told no one, including my son. For the third conversation, I prepared a portfolio. Not a resume in the traditional sense, but a clean, structured presentation of my actual track record. The client retention numbers, the diligence outcomes, the disclosure catch that saved the firm millions, the full mid-market expansion framework, restructured slightly with updated projections to reflect more current market data, but with the core analysis intact. The same 3 target firms, the same integration timeline, the same numbers that had been dismissed in under 6 minutes inside Hallstrom's conference room. I walked into Carrington Whitfield's offices on a Thursday morning. Across the table sat their chief investment officer, their head of acquisitions, and a senior managing director who I later learned had been pulled into the meeting specifically because of the technical content of the framework. They had printed copies of my documentation in front of them. They had read the materials before I arrived. I could tell from the highlighter marks and the notes in the margins. The chief investment officer opened with a question. She said, "Catherine, walk us through how you arrived at your discount rate assumptions on the second target. We have some questions about the geographic overlap risk." That was the first thing she said to me. Not a polite reframing, not a softened dismissal, A specific, sharp, technical question from a senior leader who had read the material and wanted to interrogate it properly. I walked them through it, all of it. The discount rate methodology, the geographic overlap analysis, the sensitivity tables I had run against 3 different market scenarios, the integration cost assumptions, and the labor retention modeling underneath them. The senior managing director challenged my treatment of one of the working capital adjustments. It was a fair challenge. We spent 20 minutes at a whiteboard working through the implications together, and by the end of it, we had landed on a refined assumption that was better than what I had walked in with. The head of acquisitions asked about the target relationships. She asked whether I had spoken with any of the founders directly. I told her I had. I told her which two. I told her what they had said and what I believed they would say if approached seriously. The meeting ran 2 hours and 40 minutes. At Hallstrom, I had been given 6 minutes before someone exhaled in a way that was almost a laugh. The chief investment officer walked me out herself. In the elevator, she said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "I want to be honest with you. We are not the kind of firm that decorates good work with someone else's name. If we move forward, what you build will carry your name on it. That matters to us. We have learned that the hard way." I drove home through ordinary midweek traffic and I did not feel triumphant. I felt the way a person feels when, after a long time of doubting their own measurements, someone hands them a second ruler and confirms that the first one had been accurate all along. A formal offer arrived 6 days later. Title of Managing Director, Strategy and Acquisitions. Compensation that was 37% above what I was earning at Hallstrom. A meaningful equity stake in the firm's growth plan. And written cleanly and explicitly into the offer letter, full creator credit and intellectual property attribution for the mid-market expansion framework as a condition of my joining. I signed it on a Sunday afternoon at my kitchen table. The same table I had sat at the night I made the decision. The same table where I had read my son the news 2 years earlier that I had been passed over for a promotion I had earned. I signed it slowly without ceremony, and I put the document into a folder and went to bed early. Monday morning, I walked into Hallstrom Capital Group and submitted my resignation. 2 weeks' notice, professionally written in person to Howard at 8:45. I have watched people resign from firms before. Some are walked out the same afternoon. Some are handed a card and a bouquet. What I encountered was something different. Something closer to a slow, quiet realization that spread through the senior leadership over the next 72 hours like a leak no one wanted to be the first to acknowledge. Howard sat with my letter for almost a full minute before he spoke. He asked, carefully, whether anything had happened that the firm could address. I told him the decision was final. He asked if I would consider a longer transition window, perhaps 6 weeks instead of 2. I told him 2 weeks was standard and I would honor it fully. He nodded. He did not push. He looked for a moment like a man calculating something he had not yet allowed himself to calculate before. Gregory Hallstrom himself asked to see me that afternoon. He was warm. He was gracious. He told me my contributions had been valued. He used the past tense of the verb value, which I noted, though I did not say anything. He asked if there was any conversation that might change my mind. I told him I appreciated his candor and that the decision had been made carefully and was not under review. The first real signal came from outside the building. Within 48 hours of my resignation, one of the 2 named clients on my engagement letters contacted Hallstrom's client relations team and asked, directly and without diplomatic phrasing, what was happening with the strategy lead on their account. They had not been notified of any transition. They wanted to know who would be carrying the engagement forward. They wanted to know whether the analytical continuity they had paid for would be preserved. They did not phrase it as a threat. They did not need to. The fact that they called within 2 business days of an internal personnel change, they had not been formally informed of told everyone in the room exactly how much weight that relationship carried, and where the weight actually lived. I was told about the call by a former colleague who thought I should know. I did not respond. I did not contact the client. I did not need to. Inside the building, my team was beginning to navigate the scoring framework without me sitting next to them to explain the logic in real time. I had offered, professionally and in writing, to document the system during my final 2 weeks. But 2 weeks is not enough time to transfer 7 years of layered methodology to people who had used the outputs, but had never been asked to understand the inputs. I could see in the questions they brought to my office each morning that the gaps were larger and deeper than anyone in leadership had expected. On day 6 of my notice period, Brendan Maddox requested a meeting. The subject line said knowledge transition planning. I accepted it. He came into the small conference room near my office at 3 in the afternoon, sat down across from me, and asked in his calm and deliberate way whether I would be open to a consulting arrangement after my departure. A retained monthly engagement, flexible hours, generous rate. He framed it as a way for me to stay connected to the work I had built. He was professional. He was almost warm. He used the word continuity 3 times. I thanked him and declined. He asked again, slightly differently, suggesting that the firm could be flexible on terms. I gave him the same answer. He looked at me for a long moment and I watched him understand, perhaps for the first time in the 8 months we had worked in the same building, that he had badly misjudged what he had been standing next to. Before my final day, I sent a formal written notice to Hallstrom's general counsel. Short, clear, and documented. I stated that the mid-market expansion framework had been developed on personal time, using personal equipment and personal contacts, that it had never been filed under any internal initiative code, and that the early target relationships had been cultivated outside of any firm-sponsored engagement. I attached the relevant dates, the records of personal device use, and the calendar entries that demonstrated the work had occurred outside of business hours. I stated clearly that I considered the framework my intellectual property and intended to develop it in my next role. Hallstrom's legal team came back to me 3 days later, after what I was told was a careful internal review. They confirmed in writing that my position was correct. The framework was mine. There was no further matter to discuss. I read the email twice. I closed my laptop. I finished packing the small box of personal items from my office, mostly a few framed photographs and a coffee mug my son had given me for a birthday years earlier. On a Friday afternoon, I shook a few hands, said quiet goodbyes to the people who had been kind to work with over the years, and walked out of the building for the last time. The February sky had cleared. The city looked the way cities look when something has shifted but has not yet announced itself. I started at Carrington Whitfield Partners the following Monday. They had cleared my office before I arrived. My name was already on the door. The framework with my name attached to its cover page was already circulating through the firm's investment committee under a slightly refined title. The Mid-Market Acquisition Strategy, Phase 1. Catherine Holloway, Managing Director, Strategy and Acquisitions. Within 72 hours of my resignation from Hallstrom, I had not only joined a competitor, I had begun executing the exact strategy that had been dismissed 2 weeks earlier inside a conference room 22 floors above the same city. I am telling you this story from a distance now. It has been 16 months since I walked out of Hallstrom's building. 16 months since the performance review that called me a solid contributor. 16 months since a room of senior leaders heard the mid-market expansion framework and moved on to discuss a branding refresh. Here is where things stand. The first acquisition closed in month 9. The second closed in month 13. Both transactions came in within 5% of the modeled financial projections I had walked into Carrington Whitfield's offices with that Thursday morning. The third target, the one I had been less certain about, declined our initial overture and remains in active conversation. We expect a decision within the next 2 quarters. Combined first-year revenue contribution from the 2 completed acquisitions is tracking just above $2.5 million. The framework as a whole is now being applied to a second set of regional targets in an adjacent market segment. My team at Carrington Whitfield has grown from 3 people to 9. 2 of those 9 were colleagues who left Hallstrom in the months after I did, not because I recruited them, but because they reached out to me on their own and asked whether there was a path forward in the work I was building. 2 of Hallstrom's institutional clients moved their primary strategy engagements to Carrington Whitfield within 6 months of my departure. I did not solicit them. I did not need to. They had spent years working with me, and when I moved, the relationships moved with me. That is not something a firm can prevent with a paragraph in an engagement letter. That is what happens when trust lives in a person, not in a logo on a glass door. My compensation is something I would not have believed 3 years ago. The equity I was granted at signing has already appreciated significantly. I do not tell you any of this to make a point about money. I tell you because for 11 years I was told, in ways both explicit and quiet, that I was worth precisely what Hallstrom was paying me. I wanted to know whether that was true. It was not. It had not been true for a long time. My son graduated in the spring. He took a job in a different city. The conversation about textbooks and tuition is no longer a conversation that carries any weight in our family. He called last month to tell me he was thinking about applying to a doctoral program in the next cycle. We talked for over an hour. I told him to take his time, choose carefully, and pick what felt right. It was the kind of conversation you can only really have when the pressure underneath it has finally lifted. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe to join the community. I share real workplace stories every day for anyone who believes that quiet competence deserves to be recognized, not just used. As for Hallstrom Capital Group, I do not follow them closely, but some things reach you regardless. The scoring framework I had built over 7 years required outside consultants within 4 months of my departure to stabilize. The mid-market strategic repositioning concept that Brendan Maddox had presented to the partners remains, as far as I have been told, in what is described as a strategic evaluation phase. A concept in evaluation, without the analytical infrastructure to support it, without the founder relationships to anchor it, without the person who actually built it sitting in the room when the difficult questions get asked. It remains exactly what it had always been from the moment Brendan Maddox first wrote it down. A well-formatted idea inside a well-formatted document, waiting for someone who could turn it into something real. I have heard, through people who would know, that Hallstrom's mid-market revenue has continued to drift sideways. I have heard that 2 more senior analysts left in the 3rd quarter after my departure. I have heard that Brendan Maddox was promoted to Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives sometime in the autumn, which I noted without surprise. The firm has not yet adjusted to the fact that promotion and performance are not the same thing. They will eventually. Markets are slow, but they are not stupid. Gregory Hallstrom reached out to me through a mutual acquaintance about 9 months ago. The acquaintance carried a message that Gregory would welcome a conversation, perhaps over lunch, perhaps to discuss whether there might be some form of collaboration between Carrington Whitfield and Hallstrom on a future transaction. I responded politely. I said I appreciated the gesture, and that my current responsibilities did not leave room for that kind of conversation at the moment. I did not extend any further opening. The acquaintance understood. I never heard from Gregory again. I think about the 11 years sometimes, what they cost me, what I gave away without ever being asked. The evenings, the weekends, the conversations with my son that were shorter than they should have been because I was rereading a model on my laptop at the kitchen table. The recruiter calls I declined out of loyalty to a firm that had already decided quietly that loyalty ran only in one direction. I do not regret the work itself. The work was real. The work mattered. The work taught me almost everything I know about how capital actually moves through the world and how people behave when they think no one important is watching. I am proud of what I built at Hallstrom, even the parts that ended up with someone else's name attached to them. The pride is mine. They cannot take that, and they have not tried. What I regret is how long I waited to understand something that had been true the entire time. My value did not depend on whether the room recognized it. My value did not increase or decrease based on Brendan Maddox's body language at a conference table. My value did not require the approval of a firm that had stopped looking carefully at what its own people were doing. The lesson I would offer if I were asked is not that you should leave the place that does not see you. That is too simple. Sometimes staying is the right answer for reasons that have nothing to do with how you are treated. The lesson is that you should know, with clarity and without sentiment, what you are actually worth. Not what they tell you, not what your title suggests, not what your last performance review claimed. What you are worth measured against the work itself, against the outcomes, against the people who would hire you tomorrow if they understood what you were doing today. Your value does not disappear because the people in the room fail to see it. It simply waits patiently for a room that is paying attention. And those rooms exist. I want you to believe that. Those rooms exist. I sat in one of them on a Thursday morning in February, and the woman across the table from me asked me a sharp, technical, serious question about a discount rate assumption. And I understood in that moment that I had finally walked into a place where the work itself was the language being spoken. That is the room you are looking for. Keep walking until you find it.